Thank you very much. Thank you and welcome. Welcome to Threshold of Pope. I'm Father Mitch Packwood, and we usually go through some of the documents of the church. But today I'm doing something that's been a little bit different, like we did last week, in which we are dealing with the question of how the church dealt with slavery. This is the second show in this three-part series. And we already took a look at some of the scriptural teaching about slavery, which has certain mixtures to it, how the church, once the church entered into the Roman Empire, began to work on changing. As a matter of fact, it had a different attitude towards slaves than the rest of the people in the Roman Empire did, and slowly and gradually emphasized the equal dignity of slaves, that they could be as easily as baptized as anybody else. They could be married, which slaves didn't have a right to otherwise. And eventually more and more Christians, including bishops, priests, and popes, would buy slaves in order to set them free. And as time went on, various Christians, men and women alike, influenced both the Roman emperors and later the barbarian kings who became Christian to cease slavery. And England was the first country to make slavery illegal, but it became, non-practiced, if not illegal, in the various other multiple states of Europe as Europe became Christian. But then we dealt with a new problem that arose in the 15th century when Pope Eugene IV responded to the beginning of the slave trade in the Canary Islands and put it under automatic excommunication. January 13th, 1435. Think about that. That's, a good 67 years before the discovery of the Americas. And then Pope Paul II later on in the 1460s, and one that we have a better copy of is Pope Paul III, who in 1537 said a little bit further than Pope Eugene. Well, Pope Eugene said, look, you have people who are Christians and who want to be Christians, and you can't enslave them. But Pope Paul III took it a further step and said, look, whether they want to be Christians or not, you may not make them slaves. And that was in his absolutely key writing called Sublimus Deus of May 29th, 1537, especially focusing on the enslavement of indigenous peoples. This papal attitude of being opposed to slavery and imposing excommunication on anybody involved in the slave trade continued on into the 17th and 18th centuries as well. Pope Urban VIII and a number of other popes also went and condemned this. Benedict XIV condemned it. Pope Pius VII condemned it. This was the consistent teaching of the papacy. And finally, we get into a time that has a certain amount of influence in the United States, and that is with Pope Gregory XVI. Pope Gregory XVI. This is written in 1839, December 3rd, 1839. And this was when our own nation was very much involved. New slave trade was forbidden, but they couldn't bring slaves over legally anymore. But the slave trade continued. So he wrote an apostolic letter condemning the slave trade. That's what his In Supremo Apostolatus is subtitled. Apostolic letter condemning the slave trade. Now, let's take a look at this, okay? First, that placed at the summit of apostolic power, that's what in Supremo Apostolatus means. And although lacking in merits and holding the place of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who being made man through utmost charity, deigned to die for the redemption of the world. We have judged that it belonged to our pastoral solicitude to exert ourselves to turn away the faithful from the inhuman slave trade in Negroes and in all other men. So this is his thing. And again, it's important to pay attention to the reasoning process. He's doing this on the basis of being at the summit of the apostolic power. He's Pope. And he's doing this as holding the place of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who was made man through his charity for our redemption. And just as we saw, with Paul III, the issue is that all people are capable of receiving God's redemption. Therefore, we must be stopped from taking part in any way in the slave trade. That's going to be his concern. In his day, it was mostly the African slave trade that had been going on. But there are other peoples, especially Native Americans. Back in the 1770s, the Portuguese and Spanish tried again to enslave the Native Americans in South America. And the Jesuits, who had started a lot of missions in Latin America, if you see the movie The Mission, that's fictionalized somewhat, as Hollywood is wont to do, because they have some of the priests going in and fighting in the battles and stuff. They didn't do that. That's Hollywood nonsense. But the Jesuits did form these communities to protect the Native Americans, and the Portuguese attacked, and the Spanish helped them to overthrow these missions and make the natives into slaves. So that's the background of why he's writing some of this. Assuredly, since there was spread abroad, first among the Christians, the light of the gospel. The Christians received this light of the gospel. These miserable people, and he uses the word miserable in its Latin sense, the people who are capable of mercy, but are also in having great difficulties, who in such great numbers, and chiefly through the effects of war, fell into very cruel slavery, and they experienced an alleviation of their lot. So in the ancient Roman Empire, we talked about that. Most of the slaves were won in war, and that was that's where the misery of their lot came from, being made slaves after war. War is bad enough, but then to be made a slave, if you survived the war, made it even more miserable. But the church alleviated their lot, inspired, in fact, by the divine Spirit. So the Holy Spirit inspired them. The apostles, it is true, exhorted the slaves themselves to obey their masters according to the flesh, as though obeying Christ. And we talked about this in the last episode. In the time of the early church, 1/3 of the Roman Empire was composed of slaves. About 1/3 of the empire were slaves. And these few apostles and early missionaries didn't have any hope of ending slavery when they were so few. How could the church do that? As a matter of fact, everybody in the ancient world was well aware of the 3 major slave revolts that had happened in Italy, including the one led by Spartacus, and how it led to huge slaughters of the slaves. So this was not something that the early Christians were going to try to do. But what they did do is add to the Christians who were masters of slaves and said to them to act well towards the slaves. No Roman would say such a thing. A slave was totally at the disposition of the owner. Telling the master of a slave to treat the slaves well and to give the slaves what was just and equitable and to abstain from menaces, knowing that they have a common master. Both the slaves and the slave owners have the same master, namely Jesus Christ. And that he's in heaven, and with him there is no distinction of persons. That was a radical teaching in the Roman Empire, that there's no distinction. Just because somebody is a slave and somebody else is their owner, Christ will not judge the owner with exemption. Good example of that would be the rich man, Dives, and Lazarus. Just because he was rich didn't mean that he could get away with abusing Lazarus. Neither could slave owners be exempt from Christ's judgment for the way they treated their slaves. That's what the early apostles began as a process that led to the liberation of slaves. But as the law of the gospel universally and earnestly enjoined a sincere charity towards all, whether slave or master, and considering that our Lord Jesus Christ had declared that he considered as done to him or as refused to himself everything kind and merciful, or refused to the small and the needy. Remember that. Now that goes back, think Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 and following. When Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes on the clouds with his angels to judge the nations, he will have the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And he'll say to the sheep, when I was hungry and thirsty and naked and in prison and sick, you helped me. And I said, when did we see you? Whenever you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. Here, Pope Gregory XVI is saying that in the early church, they applied that even to slaves. No Roman citizen would ever do that on the basis of Roman law, but the church did. So he goes on to say that this applies also to the way Christians should treat their slaves as their brothers in Christ. And above all, they're Christian slaves. And that they should be more inclined to set free those who merited it. And St. Gregory of Nyssa, who came from what's now Turkey, but was called Asia Minor, St. Gregory from the city of Nyssa said that on the feast of Easter, people would set slaves free. That was a fairly common thing. There were many Christians who were moved by ardent charity and cast themselves into bondage in order to redeem others. And Clement I, Pope Clement I of holy memory, now Pope St. Clement I of holy memory, declares to have come to his knowledge that now Pope St. Clement, when did he live? He was writing his first encyclical to the people of Corinth in 95. And it may well be that Clement may have been a slave, but he's aware of the liberation of slaves as well. In the process of time, the fog of pagan superstition being more completely dissipated, and the manners of barbarous people having been softened thanks to the faith and to Christian charity, it at last comes about that several centuries there are no more slaves in the greater number of Christian nations. And that's historically correct, that for the most part, slavery disappeared in the Christian countries, England first, and other nations as well. But, and we say this with profound sorrow, there were to be found afterwards among faithful men, that is, among Christians, who were shamefully blinded by the desire of sordid gain. They wanted to make money. But the way that they wanted to make money became sordid, dirty, that is to say. In lonely and distant countries, because they did not hesitate to reduce to slavery Indians, Negroes, and other wretched peoples, or else by instituting or developing the trade of those who've been made slaves by others to favor their unworthy practice. Now, what's he talking about here? In Africa, the slave trade was not, I remember reading in one internet history of Christianity and slave trade, that Christianity was the biggest one, the proponents of the slave trade. That's not true. It was the Muslims who did most of the slave trading, and they traded them to the Christians. Muslim slave traders would make raids into Africa, east and west, and they would capture Africans and take them as slaves. And there were two routes. Actually, the more difficult route was to have the slaves walk across the Sahara Desert through Timbuktu, and then on the way to the coast, and then from there they'd be taken to Turkey. And the majority of the African slaves went into the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire. That was major slave trade, and that same slave trade, though now mostly through West Africa, continues to this day. But we see still Boko Haram still captures fellow Africans as slaves and sells them, especially girls. And then the other slave trade went to the west coast of Africa, and they sold them to Christian traders who brought the African slaves over to the Americas, North and South America alike. So that's what he means by others who were doing this and making slaves by other people. And then by taking part in it, these Christians who bought the slaves were favoring the slave trade. And the Pope is trying to emphasize, Pope Gregory XVI, that they were still just as culpable as the Muslims that were doing the slave trade. Just because they bought it from Muslims, that did not make it right. It was still a wrong, participating in an evil practice. Certainly, many of the Roman pontiffs, many of the popes, our predecessors of glorious memory, did not fail, according to the duties of their charge, to severely blame as this way of acting as dangerous for the spiritual welfare of those engaged in the slave traffic. And it was shameful to the Christian name. And we mentioned, many of those popes, especially Eugene IV, Paul III, but others who wrote shorter letters, some of which are not easy to get copies of at this point. People like Paul II, Urban VIII, and Benedict XIV, and others. So again and again, they condemned this because it was harmful to the slave traders, not to mention the dignity of the people that were making slaves. That was equally harmful. And that these popes of the earlier times foresaw that infidel peoples would be more and more strengthened in their hatred of the true religion. Rightfully, I mean, you can understand why such bad example by Catholics and Protestants too, who were engaged in the slave trade, would cause the faith to be looked badly upon. And it still goes on to this day. There's still many people, again, they oftentimes exaggerate the teaching of the church. They underestimate that the church condemned the slave trade, and they exaggerate some of the statements out of context, so they miss it. But, you know, the fact that Christians were involved in the slave trade still is a point of scandal. It is at these practices that are aimed the apostolic letter of Pope Paul III from 1537 and addressed to the Archbishop Cardinal of Toledo, Spain, as well as another letter by Urban VIII in 1639 to the Collector Urium of Portugal. And in the latter, they are severely and particularly condemned those who should dare, quote, to reduce to slavery the Indians of the Eastern and Southern Indies, to sell them, buy them, exchange them, or give them separate from their wives and children, so breaking up families of the slaves, to despoil them of their goods and properties because they also had a basic human right to their own property and goods, or conduct or transport them into other regions, to help, favor, and cooperation to those acting, so helping in any way, participating in the slave trade in any way, was equally condemnable. No matter what the pretext or the excuse, because anybody who commits sin can come up with all sorts of excuses. Well, I didn't know it was so bad. Well, why didn't you? Why didn't you? I mean, think of it this way. If for no other reason, would you want to be a slave yourself? Well, of course not. Well, if you don't want to be a slave, what makes you think you have the right to make somebody else a slave? There's no reason for that. And the Pope is very clear on getting that across. That they have no reason for this. And they proclaim and teach that this way of acting is allowable. They're lying. They say, oh, no, it's okay for me. Yeah, and they cooperate in any way, whatever, in the practices of slavery. So they say, well, what does that Pope in Rome know about trying to run a plantation in Brazil or America? He doesn't understand how you have to have people that can stand the heat. And these slaves, whether it be the Native Americans or whether it be the African slaves, they can work in the heat. They're used to it. White people would die. So we need to have them as our slaves. That was some of the logic. That was the logic that was used. But what he's saying is, you're not telling the truth. It is not permissible to make these people slaves and transform them. He then goes on to summarize the teaching of Pope Benedict XIV, who confirmed and renewed the penalties of the earlier popes, namely automatic excommunication for taking part in the slave trade. He wrote an apostolic letter, December 20th, 1741, to the bishops of Brazil and other regions, in which he stimulated to the same end the solicitude of the governors. He wanted the people who were the governors of those colonies to make sure that they understood that they may not take part or condone the slave trade. Pope Pius II as the Portuguese were getting control over New Guinea, sent in 1462 a letter to a bishop who is leaving to go to New Guinea. And in the letter, he not only gives the bishop himself the means of exercising the sacred ministry of being a bishop with more fruit, but also gives grave warnings to the Christians who would reduce people in New Guinea to slavery. So while he tells the bishop, it's okay for you to go ahead and be the bishop of New Guinea, warn the people that they may not in any way make the people slaves. Now, that's 1462. Again, and that's before the Americas were discovered. Now, these warnings are, among others, we're going to take a break in just another minute or so, a few seconds, but you can see that the papal concern was something consistent as slavery kicked up again in the modern world. Because we look to we think back, 1400s, a long time ago. That's the beginning of the modern world with the discovery of the Americas and stuff. And this is something that, they condemned. If you would like to learn some more about this, not only can you get some of these documents by the popes from EWTN.com website in our documents library, but also there's a wonderful book. It came out some years ago. It's called The Popes and Slavery by Father Joel S. Panzer, Panzer. It's from the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. And you can get that from EWTN's religious catalog. Either go on the website, EWTNRC.com, or you can call 1-800-854-6316. We're going to come back and finish this letter by Pope Gregory XVI, talk about some of its effects in this country, and then take a look at one last letter on slavery by Pope Leo XIII. So please stay with us. And we are doing this special program, a series of programs, 3 of them, on papal teaching about slavery. And it's very important for us to understand that. And we're finishing up with Pope Gregory XVI. But I have just, let me finish that up first, and then we'll take a question from our studio audience, because we're almost done with this. So let's just go to that real quickly and then get a comment from our studio audience, okay? Because he's telling us something interesting. Again, in Pope Gregory XVI, in Supremo Apostolatus, we're dealing with this one last couple paragraphs. He mentions in our own time, that is in his time, Pope Pius VII, he was the one who was made a prisoner by Napoleon. And Napoleon made this claim, I have destroyed the Catholic Church. And Pope Pius VII said, look, if we priests and bishops haven't been able to do it in 1800 years, you don't have a chance. But I digress. Pope Pius VII was moved with the same religious and charitable spirit as his predecessors, and he intervened zealously with those in possession of power to secure that the slave trade should at least cease among the Christians. He couldn't stop it among the Muslims. He couldn't stop the Ottoman Turks, but he wanted it to cease among the Christians. and that the penalties imposed and the care given by our predecessors contributed in no small measure, with the help of God, to protect Indians and other peoples mentioned against the cruelty of the invaders or of the cupidity of Christian merchants, without, however, carrying success to such a point that the Holy See could rejoice over the complete success of its efforts in that direction. For, as the Pope Gregory XVI said, for the slave trade, although it has diminished in 1839, it was already down quite a bit in more than one district, it is still practiced by numerous Christians. This is why, desiring to remove such a shame from all the Christian nations, having fully reflected over the whole question, and having taken the advice of many of our venerable brothers, the cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, and walking in the footsteps of the popes who came before them, our predecessors, we warn and adjure earnestly in the Lord faithful Christians of every condition, that no one in the future dare to vex anyone, to despoil them of their possessions, reduce anyone to servitude, or lend aid and favor to those who give themselves up to these practices. You can't even help somebody in the slave trade. Or exercise that inhuman traffic by which the blacks, as if they were not men but rather animals, having been brought into servitude in no matter what way, are in any distinction, without distinction, in contempt of the rights and the justice of humanity. And they're people who were bought, sold, and devoted to the hardest labor. This is absolutely forbidden in any kind of this trade. Further, there are some people who, in hope of gain, propositions of purchase being made to the first owners of blacks, dissensions and perpetual conflicts are aroused in these regions. So there were already, before his reign, the British were engaged in anti-slave wars. And it would be just 21 years after he wrote this that the United States would be involved in a civil war. So he says that by virtue of our apostolic authority, we reprove, that is, forbid and condemn, all the practices above mentioned as absolutely unworthy of the Christian name. By the same authority as Pope, we prohibit and strictly forbid any ecclesiastic, that is, any member of the church, any priest or bishop, or layperson, from presuming to defend as permissible this traffic in blacks, under no matter what pretext or excuse, or from publishing or teaching in any manner whatsoever, in public or privately, opinions contrary to what we set forth in this apostolic letter. Now, this is pretty strong. He would not permit any priest or lay person or bishop to in any way defend the slave trade in the least. This caused great consternation because, in fact, even in these United States, there were clergy who owned slaves. My own order, the Jesuits, had slaves in Maryland on the plantation that they had. They set them free, but they did own slaves. And they didn't set them free right away. And in fact, there was one priest, I believe he was the president of Georgetown University, who not only sold a family of slaves, but sold the father to somebody different from the wife and children and broke up the family. Pope Gregory was so outraged, completely outraged by that, that he called that priest back to Rome, and he was removed from his office at Georgetown and was not allowed back. I don't think he came back to the United States. I'm not positive of that, but he was treated with great severity because he disobeyed this. Furthermore, there were bishops, particularly the Bishop of Charleston in South Carolina, who met with President Polk, President James Polk, who said, "Oh, don't worry about Pope Gregory's letter. He's just saying he can't do the trade, the new slave trade," but he was giving excuses, as were some of the other bishops and some of the priests in the United States, saying that the slave trade was, don't take the Pope too seriously. They were defending it because President Polk was already afraid that as the country continued to have this split, some states were free states that didn't allow slavery, others were slave states. And this was getting more and more tense. Again, there were other issues involved in the Civil War, that the tariffs charged on products from southern ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans were not charged to the northern ports. And that was another real serious problem, to be sure, but slavery was an issue. And even though the Pope had clearly condemned the slave trade, and he condemned anybody trying to defend it, there were still priests and bishops who did so. As I had first read some of the work by Father Panzer, we mentioned Father Joel Panzer's book, The Popes and Slavery. When I first read that, I was so struck by the similarity to the way so many bishops also argued against the teaching of Pope Paul VI in regards to birth control. And they argued that, he's overstating it to say that this will lead to rampant abortion and such. And some of the bishops even talked about there's more important to have freedom of choice on this. And that this is how they took it. This is a human thing that people do. We defend what the culture accepts, even when the culture accepts the unacceptable. We saw it with the slave trade, and it went on for centuries, leading to devastation of Africans and Native Americans, devastation of their lives, and the uprooting of their lives in ways that were absolutely unjust. And people say, well, the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. They did know what they were talking about. They were dealing with very basic human rights issues. And today, we are in a similar position where we are dealing with basic human rights issues regarding birth. And we see this go on. Think about how this passed on. In the United States, the Supreme Court said not only is somebody a slave, no matter what state they go to, whether a slave or a free state, but they also said in the Dred Scott decision that African Americans, people born of African descent, are inherently inferior to Caucasians. That was the teaching of the Supreme Court. How different is that from their attitude on the unborn? They are also inherently inferior to people outside the womb. Only outside the womb can you defend their lives. And we have theologians who ignore it or even teach contrary to that. We have to pay attention to the inherent rights of people of all societies and cultures that they are born with. They aren't given by the states. No state has the right to give anybody their basic human rights or take it away. That's in our Declaration of Independence. Basic human rights are given directly by God to each individual by virtue of them being human beings. And their racial background, their cultural background makes no impact on reducing that. That has been the teaching of the church through the centuries. And its neglect caused great problems for everybody who neglected it or who were victims of their neglect. This is very, very important to keep in mind. But there's still a further issue about this slavery concern that we'll continue to deal with. I just want to deal with the question. We have one from our studio audience. I'd like to deal with that gentleman. Sir, where are you from? Maryland. Good to see you. Were you born in Maryland?
No, I was born in Costa Rica.
Costa Rica, a beautiful country. I've been there. And it's a lovely, lovely country, so long as they don't bring in any dinosaurs like in those movies. So anyway, what's your question?
Actually, it's a comment.
Okay.
When you were talking about the Indians in Latin America, some years ago, when the Supreme Court declared that the on-board was not a person, a friend of mine from Colombia made another comment saying that friends of his would go hunting in the jungles of Colombia, and even perhaps some people in Venezuela as well in Brazil, but he wasn't sure. But at least in Colombia, people would go hunting Indians because they would think, or they were thought at that time, that Indians were not persons.
So is this somebody in your own lifetime?
Yes.
Not your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather?
In the early, around 73, after the Supreme Court passed that.
So that kind of disregard of Native Americans, the people of the jungles of Colombia, because there's still areas of Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Paraguay where Native folks live in very simple, in terms of technology, Stone Age technology in many ways. And they're treated not as humans, but as animals that can be hunted.
At that time, I don't know now.
Hopefully not. But even then, that was contrary to the commandments of God. Thou shalt not kill applies directly to that. That's murder. And so, and if somebody feels that they can hunt them like an animal, you can see how somebody else might think, well, I can work them like an animal. And that, you see where that logic leads to. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because this is something that is horrible. Now, the church's opposition to slavery did not end in 1839. There is still one more encyclical by a pope. It's by Pope Leo XIII. It is called In Plurimus, and it's dated May 5th, 1888, and it is on the abolition of slavery. Okay, so that this is it's a bit longer. We won't need to go through all parts of it, but we want to go through some of it. It's a wonderful one as the last statement or the last encyclical on slavery. Pope Leo XIII wrote that amid the many and great demonstrations of affection which from almost all the peoples of the earth have come to us and are still coming to us in attaining the happy 50th anniversary of our priesthood. So this is when he was 50 years a priest. He was ordained in 1838. There's one which moves us in a special way. It came from Brazil, whereupon the occasion of this happy event, large numbers of those in that vast empire. See, Brazil had its own emperor at one point. That people from this empire who groan beneath the yoke of slavery have been legally set free. That was an ordination gift that he really appreciated. It goes back to the ancient times where Christians were setting slaves free. And he appreciated that a gift for his 50th anniversary was the freedom of slaves. This work is so full of the spirit of Christian mercy. It has been offered up in cooperation with the clergy by charitable members of the laity of both sexes, to God, the author and giver of all good things, and that it was given, that the slaves were set free in testimony of their gratitude for the favor of the health and years that had been granted to Pope Leo XIII. But this was especially sweet and acceptable to us because it lent confirmation to the belief that the great majority of the people of Brazil desired to see the cruelty of slavery ended and rooted out from the land. And this popular feeling has been seconded by the Emperor of Brazil and his daughter, and also by the ministers by means of various laws that have been introduced and sanctioned. And that this is something that he then wanted to address the bishops of Brazil in favor of the abolition of all slavery. Now, just as an historical background, why did Brazil still have slaves in the 1880s? It's very late. They didn't have the slave trade anymore, but they had people who were descendants of slaves and remained in servitude. Well, one of the reasons is that unlike the Spanish and English lands, where lots of people from England came to the colonies, and lots of people from Spain went to their colonies, the Portuguese mostly sent men and not women. And as a result, the procreation of people in the Portuguese colony of Brazil largely came from slave women. That the Portuguese men would have children with the slave women. And there was a high level of slavery on into the 1880s. So that's part of the background, historically, of what went on. But the Pope still was against it, as the other popes had been. He says, in paragraph 2 of the encyclical, we indeed are the vicar of Christ, the Son of God, to all men. Christ, who so loved the human race that not only did he not refuse taking our nature to himself and to live among us, but he delighted in bearing the name Son of Man, openly proclaiming that he had come upon the earth, quote, to preach deliverance to the captives. That was something that Jesus had spoken in the synagogue of Nazareth, as recorded in Luke chapter 4, when he cites Isaiah and says that his ministry is to preach liberation to the captives. In order that rescuing mankind from the worst slavery, which is the slavery of sin. As a matter of fact, St. Paul and other New Testament writers mostly speak about slavery in the sense of speaking of being enslaved to sin. That's the ultimate slavery. And they used slavery as an image of being under the control of sin. If you find that exaggerated, just ask an alcoholic or a drug addict how easy it is to become free of their addictions. They really feel caught up and enslaved by their addictions. So having Christ free us from the slavery of sin is a very positive thing, so that he might reestablish all things that are in heaven and on earth, and bring back all the children of Adam from the depths of the ruin of the common fall to their original dignity. Now again, we're seeing the same kind of logic as we saw with the earlier popes. It wasn't just that they didn't like the economic system of slavery, They understood slavery as an attack on human dignity. And that human dignity comes from being created with reason and free will. And slavery attacks that dignity, that original dignity. Pope St. Gregory the Great spoke in a way applicable here. Says, since our Redeemer, it's from Pope Gregory the Great, since our Redeemer, the author of all life, deigned to take on human flesh, that by the power of his Godhead, the chains by which we were held in bondage are being broken. So Christ broke the chains of sin that held us bondage, that he might restore us to our first state of liberty. It is most fitting that men, by the concession of manumission is the word for setting slaves free, so that by setting slaves free should restore to freedom in which they were born those whom nature sent free into the world, but have been condemned to the yoke of slavery by the law of the nations. So Pope Gregory in the 500s AD was also speaking of how we need to set slaves free. Manumission, the setting free of slaves, is a consistent papal teaching. It is right, therefore, and obviously in keeping with our apostolic office, that we should favor and advance by every means in our power whatever it helps to secure for men, whether as individual persons or as communities, safeguards against the many miseries which, like the fruits of an evil tree, have sprung from the sin of our first parents, from original sin. Now in this, he's teaching what St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas said, that slavery is not a good created by God, but it is the result of original sin and the fall into sin. And that such safeguards, of whatever kind they be, would help to promote civilization and the amenities of life, and lead on to the universal restitution of all things which our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, contemplated and desired. Christ wants everybody to be reconstituted in the freedom that they have as their birthright as human beings created with reason and free will. That's what he wants. Now, we're going to continue this encyclical next week. But you may ask, well, you've been talking about slavery. I thought that was abolished. As I said last week, I want to say it again today. There are more people who are slaves today in the third millennium, in the 2000, the early part of this century. There are more slaves today than there were in the 1700s or the 1800s. The difference is this. They were then slaves forced to work in the cotton fields. Today, the human trade and bondage is in the sex trade, so that they are slaves between cotton sheets. And that this sex slavery continues to this day, shows up in pornography industry, and in the prostitution industry, and in places where people go for what they call sex vacations. And that they are engaging in sex with children who are slaves, and women who are slaves. And these slaves are also brought from third world and from Eastern Europe countries to the United States to be sex slaves. It hasn't stopped. And we have to be just as much against it as we were in the past years. Again, I urge you to read the book, The Popes and Slavery by Father Joel Panzer. Get that from ewtnrc.com or call them 1-800-854-6316. And apply what was said then to the dignity of people in the sex trade industry as well. May mighty God bless you with his freedom and the use of your minds and reason to find his wisdom and truth. I bless you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you, and remind you that we can bring you these and all of our programs only because this network is brought to you by you. Keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill so we can pay our bills. Thank you.